Find somewhere comfortable, wherever you are right now, in bed, on a sofa, curled beneath something warm. You are exactly where you need to be. You don't need to follow this closely. You don't need to hold on to any of it. The words will arrive on their own, and if some of them drift past without landing, that is perfectly fine. That is, in fact, the idea. Tonight, we are going a long way back, further than history, further than the oldest cities, older than the first farms, older than pottery and writing and the wheel. We are going back to a time when the world was cold in a way that is difficult to imagine now, when ice stretched across continents, when the sky over northern Europe was the color of ash for months at a time, when the wind off the glaciers carried a kind of silence that no living person has ever heard. And in that silence, something happened, something small and gradual and utterly unrepeatable. A large grey animal edged a little closer to a fire, and everything changed. We are in no hurry tonight. The story has already waited 30,000 years. It can take its time with us now. To understand how dogs came to exist, you have to first understand the world that made them possible. Not the world as it is now, but the world as it was during what geologists and climate scientists call the Pleistocene, a vast stretch of Earth's recent past that lasted from roughly 2.5 million years ago until about 11,000 years ago, when the ice finally retreated and the climate settled into the relative warmth we still live in today. The period that matters most to our story sits within the later part of that epoch, roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, and extending toward what is known as the last glacial maximum, the point around 20,000 years ago when the ice sheets reached their greatest extent. Sheets of ice, a kilometer or more thick, covered what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and much of northern Europe. Sea levels were lower by more than 100 meters because so much of the planet's water was locked into those glaciers. The coastlines of the world looked nothing like they do today. Britain was connected to Europe by dry land. Alaska was connected to Siberia. The world was both smaller and vaster than we know it. In this landscape, two species were making their living as hunters. The first was Homo sapiens, our own ancestors, though they would have seemed strange to us in some ways. They were fully modern humans in the biological sense, the same brain size, the same capacity for language and abstract thought, the same emotional range. But they lived in small bands, probably no more than 20 to 50 individuals moving together, following the great herds of animals that drifted across the frozen steppes. They made tools from flint and bone. They painted animals on cave walls with a skill and sensitivity that still stops visitors in their tracks today. They wore clothing stitched from animal skins. They used fire. They planned, remembered, communicated, grieved. The second species was the wolf, not quite the grey wolf as we know it today, but a closely related ancestor, ranging widely across Eurasia and North America, living in packs of similar size to a human band, hunting the same prey, mammoth calves, reindeer, bison, horse. The wolf is one of the most socially sophisticated predators that has ever lived. A wolf pack is not simply a group of animals moving together for warmth. It is a coordinated social unit with deep individual relationships, clear communication across multiple channels, and the capacity to adjust strategy in real time during a hunt. Consider what a wolf pack actually does when it hunts. Individual wolves take on different roles. Some drive the prey, some flank it, some wait ahead on a ridge. They read each other's body language continuously. The angle of an ear, the height of a tail, the direction of a glance, and they adjust their own behavior accordingly. This is not instinct in the simple sense. It is learned, flexible, socially transmitted behavior. Young wolves watch older wolves and learn. Experienced hunters carry knowledge that gets passed down through generations of a pack. In this sense, wolves were already doing something that looks, from a distance, a great deal like culture. And here is the thing that matters most for our story. Both of these species, humans and wolves, were occupying what ecologists call the same ecological niche. A niche, in this sense, is not just a habitat, but a role. It describes what an animal eats, how it gets its food, what its social structure looks like, and how it relates to other species in the same environment. Humans and wolves were both wide-ranging pursuit predators. Both relied on cooperative group behavior to bring down prey they could not handle alone. Both cached food and returned to it. Both had strong social bonds and cared for injured or elderly members of their group. This overlap was not coincidence. It was deep structural similarity. Two lineages that had arrived at a very similar solution to the problem of surviving in a cold, prey-rich, unpredictable world, and it meant that when these two species came into regular contact, they were not meeting as strangers. They were meeting as, in some sense, ecological mirrors of each other. It is worth pausing on what the prey landscape actually looked like, because it shapes everything that follows. The mammalian megafauna of the late Pleistocene was extraordinary by any measure. Woolly mammoths stood 3.5 meters at the shoulder, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions larger than any living lion today. Giant deer, the Irish elk, with antlers spanning 3.5 meters across, bison in numbers that would seem impossible now, reindeer migrating in herds of hundreds of thousands across the tundra. For a hunter, whether human or wolf, this abundance was both an opportunity and a challenge. The prey animals were enormous. A single mammoth represented more calories than a band of humans or a wolf pack could consume in weeks. But bringing one down required coordination, courage, and a tolerance for risk that only made sense within a group. Lone hunters, human or wolf, were at a severe disadvantage. The group was everything. It is in this context that the first tentative proximity between humans and wolves begins to make sense. Both species were ranging across the same territory, tracking the same herds, returning to the same water sources, sheltering in the same valleys from the same winds. And those encounters, over thousands of years, would have ranged from violent to merely wary to, eventually, something else. There is also the matter of fire. Humans were carrying fire, maintaining it, transporting it, building it at night in sheltered hollows and cave entrances. Fire is warmth. Warmth in a glacial landscape is survival. But fire is also light. And light, in the darkness of a Pleistocene night on the open steppe, would have been visible from a very long way away. A wolf with good eyesight, and wolves have excellent eyesight, could see a human fire from several kilometers, and around that fire there would have been food. Not living prey, which requires effort and risk to catch, but discarded bones, scraps of hide, fragments of meat too small for humans to bother with, but perfectly adequate for an animal willing to wait patiently at the edge of the light. This is the world that made domestication possible. Not a world of intention or design, but a world of shared territory, shared prey, shared cold, and the slow, patient logic of survival, a logic that would, over thousands of generations, pull two very different kinds of social hunter into the same orbit. The process would not be quick. Nothing in evolution is. But the conditions were all in place. The landscape had set the table. And somewhere out on the dark steppe, a wolf was watching the firelight and deciding whether or not to come a little closer. The question of how domestication actually began, who moved first, and why, is one of the most genuinely contested questions in modern biology. It sits at the intersection of genetics, archaeology, animal behavior, and ecology, and the honest answer is that we do not know for certain. What we do have are several compelling hypotheses, a growing body of genetic and archaeological evidence, and a picture that is slowly coming into focus, even if the edges are still soft. The most widely supported idea among researchers today is sometimes called the self-domestication hypothesis, and it inverts the traditional story in a way that feels, once you hear it, almost obvious. The traditional story goes like this. Humans saw wolves, recognized their usefulness, captured some, and began selectively taming and breeding them. It says that wolves came to us, that the process was initiated not by human intention, but by wolf behavior, specifically by the behavior of a small subset of wolves who were, by the natural variation that exists in every population, a little less afraid of humans than their peers. To understand why this matters, you have to understand something about how fear works at the biological level and how it varies between individuals within a species. Every vertebrate animal, every animal with a backbone, from fish to mammals, has a system for responding to threat. When a wolf encounters something potentially dangerous, a signal travels from its sensory organs to a region deep in the brain, and from there to a small pair of glands that sit just above the kidneys. These are the adrenal glands. They release hormones, most famously adrenaline, which prepares the body for immediate action, and cortisol, which sustains the stress response over a longer period. Heart rate increases. Blood flows away from the digestive system and toward the muscles. The animal becomes hyper-alert, poised to flee or to fight. This is the stress response system, and it is extraordinarily well conserved across evolution. The basic mechanism is essentially the same in a wolf and in a human. But here is the crucial point. The sensitivity of this system varies between individuals. Some wolves have a stress response system that triggers quickly, at a low threshold of perceived threat, and takes a long time to calm down. Others have a system that is quieter, that requires a stronger stimulus to activate, and that returns to baseline more rapidly. These differences are partly genetic, encoded in the DNA of those individuals, and they are heritable, passed down to offspring. In a purely wild environment, far from humans, this variation might matter relatively little. A wolf that is somewhat less fearful than average might take slightly more risks, might approach carcasses before the dominant animal has finished, might range a little further into unfamiliar territory. But introduce a human settlement, a camp with fire, with discarded food, with the smell of cooked meat and cracked bones, and suddenly that variation becomes enormously important. The wolves at the high end of the fear spectrum would never approach. The smell of humans, the sound of human voices, the sight of human movement would trigger their stress response at a distance and send them away into the dark. But the wolves at the low end of the fear spectrum, the individuals whose adrenal glands were a little quieter, whose threshold for alarm was a little higher, those animals could edge closer. Not all the way to the fire, not immediately, but closer than their packmates, closer than any wolf had come before. And what they found there was food. Reliable, predictable, effortless food. Bones cracked open and stripped of their large muscle meat, but still rich with marrow, offal, skin. The biological waste of a successful hunt. In the brutal arithmetic of a glacial winter, when prey was scarce and the cost of a failed hunt could be starvation, a reliable caloric source, even a modest one, was a profound advantage. Wolves that could tolerate proximity to humans ate better than wolves that could not. They were more likely to survive the winter, more likely to reproduce, and their offspring inherited, on average, a slightly lower fear threshold than the population mean. This is natural selection working in real time. Not selection imposed by humans, but selection imposed by the environment, specifically by the new environmental feature that humans represented. Generation by generation, the wolves that lingered near human camps would have become, on average, slightly less fearful than those that kept their distance. The two populations, camp-edge wolves and true wild wolves, would have begun to diverge, slowly, imperceptibly in any single generation, but accumulating across hundreds of generations into something genuinely different. There is a remarkable experiment that illuminates this process, even though it was conducted not with wolves, but with silver foxes, and not in the Pleistocene, but in Siberia in the 1950s. A Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belayev, working at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, began selectively breeding foxes for a single trait: tameness toward humans. Each generation, he kept only those individuals that showed the least fear and aggression when a human hand approached their cage. He bred only the calmest 10 to 20% of each generation. Within 6 generations, within a period that would represent perhaps 30 years in foxes or a few centuries in wolves, something remarkable began to happen. The tame foxes started to look different. Their ears became floppy, their tails began to curl, their coats developed patches of white that the wild population never showed. Their skulls became slightly rounder, their snouts slightly shorter. They began to seek human attention, to wag their tails at the approach of a person, to whimper when left alone. They had not been bred for any of these traits. They had been bred only for tameness. We will return to why that happened. The mechanism is one of the most beautiful and counterintuitive ideas in all of biology. But for now, the fox experiment tells us something important. The transition from fearful to friendly can happen faster than anyone might have expected, and it brings with it a cascade of changes that no one selected for. The domestication process, once started, has its own momentum. The competing hypotheses are worth considering honestly. One is the pup adoption hypothesis, the idea that humans, encountering wolf pups in a den after killing the adults, brought those pups back to camp, raised them by hand, and in doing so created the first tame wolves. This is plausible, and it may well have happened. Humans have a well-documented tendency to adopt and raise young animals of other species. It is observed in hunter-gatherer societies today. A hand-raised wolf pup would be genuinely tame within that individual's lifetime. But individual tameness does not equal domestication. Domestication is a change in the population across generations. A single tame wolf raised by humans would still carry the genes of a wild wolf, and its offspring with a wild partner would revert toward wildness. The pup adoption hypothesis can explain individual tame animals, but struggles to explain the sustained, directional genetic change that domestication represents. The hunting partnership hypothesis, that humans deliberately selected wolves to assist in hunts, faces similar problems. It requires a level of intentional, cross-generational selective breeding that seems unlikely for the earliest stages of the process, when humans had no framework for thinking about heredity or selective breeding in any formal sense. The archaeological and genetic evidence, as it currently stands, leans most strongly toward the self-domestication model, at least for the initiation of the process. The details of where exactly this happened and when remain genuinely contested, and we will spend time with those details in a later chapter. But the broad outline seems increasingly clear. Wolves moved toward humans first. The first step across the threshold was taken on 4 paws, not 2. What that means, if you sit with it for a moment, is quietly extraordinary. The oldest friendship in the world was not formed by capture or by deliberate design. It was formed by curiosity and by hunger, and by the ancient willingness of one kind of social animal to edge, just slightly, into the warmth of another kind's fire. Something happens to an animal when it is domesticated, not just to its behavior, but to its body. Its face changes, its skeleton changes, its coat changes, its brain changes. And these changes follow a pattern so consistent across so many different domesticated species: dogs, cattle, pigs, horses, rabbits, even domesticated foxes, that biologists have given the pattern a name. They call it the domestication syndrome. The syndrome is a cluster of traits that appear together reliably whenever a wild animal is brought under the influence of human selection for tameness. Floppy ears, which wild animals almost never have, rounder skulls and shorter snouts, smaller teeth, curly or shortened tails, patches of white or unusual colors in the coat, smaller brains relative to body size, reduced adrenal glands, a tendency to retain juvenile behaviors into adulthood, playfulness, vocalization, the soliciting of attention that wild animals grow out of. These traits do not all appear in every domesticated species, and they appear to different degrees, but the pattern is real, and it is consistent enough to demand an explanation. The most compelling explanation currently available is called the neural crest hypothesis. To understand it, you need to know something about how an embryo builds itself. When a fertilized egg begins to divide and develop into an animal, it does not simply grow larger. It organizes itself into distinct regions and layers, each with its own developmental destiny. One of the most important of these early populations of cells is called the neural crest. Neural crest cells, and this is the part worth pausing on, are what biologists call multipotent, meaning that a single neural crest cell has the potential to become many different kinds of tissue. They arise early in development, near the forming spinal cord and brain, and then they migrate. They travel in coordinated streams to distant parts of the developing body, and once they arrive, they differentiate into specialized cell types. The list of tissues that neural crest cells give rise to is startling in its breadth. They form the jaw and the teeth. They form parts of the skull and face. They form the cartilage of the ears. They form the smooth muscle of major blood vessels. They form the pigment cells, called melanocytes, that give the skin and fur their color. And critically, they form a significant portion of the adrenal glands, specifically the inner part of the adrenal gland, called the adrenal medulla, which produces adrenaline. Now, hold all of that in mind. Neural crest cells travel throughout the body and build a remarkable range of structures: jaw, teeth, skull shape, ear cartilage, coat color, and the adrenal glands that drive the stress response. What the neural crest hypothesis proposes is this: when selection acts on tameness, when, generation after generation, the less fearful, less aggressive individuals are the ones that survive and reproduce near human settlements, it is acting, at least in part, on the neural crest cells. Specifically, it is selecting for a slightly reduced neural crest cell population, or for neural crest cells that migrate less vigorously, or that are somewhat less active in the adrenal medulla. The result is quieter adrenal glands, and therefore a reduced stress response. But because neural crest cells give rise to so many different tissues, reducing their activity in one place pulls on all the other structures they build. Ears depend on neural crest-derived cartilage for their stiffness. Reduce the cartilage slightly, and the ears fold forward and down, becoming floppy. Skull shape depends partly on neural crest-derived bone and cartilage. Alter the migration pattern slightly, and the snout shortens, the skull rounds, the face becomes more juvenile-looking. Coat color depends on melanocytes derived from neural crest cells. Perturb their migration, and you get patches of white, or diluted colors, or unusual patterns. The tail shape, the tooth size, even aspects of brain development are all touched by this same cellular population. So the floppy ears of a dog are not, in this view, something that humans selected for directly. They are a quiet side effect, a consequence of selecting for a calmer adrenal gland, which happened to slightly reduce the neural crest cell population that also builds ear cartilage. The curly tail is a side effect. The rounder skull is a side effect. The patchy coat is a side effect. All of these traits arrive together as a package because they all trace back to the same developmental origin. This is what biologists call pleiotropy, when a single genetic change or a change in a single cell population has effects in multiple different tissues or organ systems simultaneously. And it is one of the most important concepts in understanding how domestication could have produced such a sweeping physical transformation so relatively quickly. You do not need to select separately for floppy ears, and then for a shorter snout, and then for a gentler temperament. You select for one thing: tameness. And the rest follows, because the biology is all connected at its root. The fox experiment at Novosibirsk is again relevant here. Belyaev's tame foxes, selected only for reduced fear of humans, developed floppy ears, piebald coats, rounder faces, and curly tails within just a few dozen generations. When researchers later examined the neural crest cells of these foxes, they found exactly what the hypothesis would predict: altered patterns of neural crest cell migration and differentiation compared to the wild-type foxes. The biology matched the theory with a neatness that is genuinely satisfying. Now, alongside this whole cascade of changes driven through neural crest cells, something else was happening in the genomes of early dogs, something more specific, more molecular, and more clearly linked to the particular circumstances of living alongside humans. It is the story of a gene called AMY2B. AMY2B is the gene that codes for a digestive enzyme called amylase. Amylase is the enzyme responsible for breaking down starch, the complex carbohydrate found in grains, roots, and other plant foods. Wolves, as pure carnivores, have very little need for amylase. They have 2 copies of the AMY2B gene, one on each chromosome, which is the standard arrangement for most genes in most mammals. Their digestive systems are built for meat. But modern dogs have far more than 2 copies. Researchers comparing the genomes of dogs and wolves found that dogs carry, on average, somewhere between 4 and 30 copies of the AMY2B gene, with the number varying by breed and individual. The effect of having more copies of the gene is straightforward. More amylase is produced, and more starch can be broken down and absorbed. Dogs can digest starch roughly 5 times more efficiently than wolves can. How did this happen? Gene duplication. The process by which a segment of DNA is accidentally copied an extra time during cell division is a known and relatively common mutational event. It happens in all genomes, all the time. Normally, extra copies of a gene are neither helpful nor harmful, and they may drift to low frequency or disappear. But in a population of proto-dogs living beside humans who were increasingly eating and discarding starchy plant material, tubers dug from the ground, wild grain, the remains of early cultivation, extra amylase copies would have been a genuine advantage. Animals that could extract more energy from starchy scraps would have been better fed. Better fed animals survive and reproduce more successfully. The extra gene copies spread through the population. This is a beautiful piece of molecular evidence because it tells us something specific about the environment in which early dogs were living. The amylase adaptation did not appear in wolves that remained wild. It appeared in the lineage that was spending time near humans. And as humans began, thousands of years later, to cultivate grain more intensively, the selection pressure for high amylase copy numbers would have intensified. The dogs with the most copies would have thrived most fully in that new agricultural world. What we see in the genome of a modern dog, then, is a record of its history, not written in words, but in the number of copies of a particular gene, in the altered migration patterns of embryonic cells, in the shape of the skull and the hang of the ear. The body of a dog is an archive. And once you know how to read it, it tells a story that goes back 30,000 years, to a cold night on a frozen steppe, to a wolf at the edge of firelight, and to the slow, connected, cascading biology that followed. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that we can reach back 30,000 years and read the genetic code of an animal that lived and died before the last ice age ended. That we can hold a fragment of bone no larger than a thumbnail, extract from it the chemical traces of a long-vanished creature, and reconstruct from those traces a portrait of who that animal was, where it came from, and whether it was already, in some meaningful biological sense, a dog. Ancient DNA research, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from archaeological remains, is one of the most transformative scientific developments of the last 2 decades. DNA is a fragile molecule. Under normal conditions, it degrades rapidly after death. Enzymes break it apart, water hydrates and fragments it, microbes consume it. Under most circumstances, nothing readable survives more than a few thousand years. But in cold, dry conditions, in permafrost, in dry caves, in the sealed chambers of ancient burials, degradation slows to a near halt. Individual fragments of DNA can persist for tens of thousands of years, chemically bonded to the mineral matrix of bone and tooth. To extract ancient DNA, researchers grind a small amount of bone, usually from the inner ear, which is the densest bone in the skull and offers the best preservation, into a fine powder, then use a series of chemical processes to isolate and purify whatever genetic material remains. What they recover is not intact DNA. It is millions of tiny fragments, each only a few dozen to a few hundred base pairs long. A base pair being one rung of the DNA ladder, one unit of genetic information. But modern sequencing technology can read all of those fragments simultaneously, and powerful computational methods can then assemble them like an extraordinarily complex jigsaw puzzle into a coherent genome. The resulting sequence will have gaps, and it will carry the chemical signatures of ancient damage, certain chemical changes to the DNA bases that accumulate over time and actually help researchers confirm they are working with genuinely ancient material rather than modern contamination. But from this damaged, fragmentary record, a remarkable amount of information can be recovered. Which population did this animal belong to? How closely was it related to modern wolves? Or to modern dogs? Did it carry the genetic variants associated with domestication? Was it part of a population that was already diverging from wild wolves? Now, the key sites. The oldest candidates for dog remains come from two locations: the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where a skull estimated at roughly 33,000 years old has been proposed as a very early proto-dog, and a cave in Belgium, where another ancient skull of similar age was found. These identifications are contested. The skulls have dog-like features, shorter snouts, broader palates, wider brain cases than typical wolves of the period. But whether these animals were genuinely on the path to domestication or simply represented a regional wolf population with slightly unusual morphology remains debated. The ancient DNA from these specimens has not resolved the question cleanly, partly because the oldest DNA is the most damaged and the hardest to interpret. The picture becomes clearer and warmer as we move forward in time. At Bonn Oberkassel, a small town on the Rhine in Germany, a grave was excavated in the early 20th century. It dated to approximately 14,200 years ago, the very end of the Pleistocene, as the ice was beginning its long retreat. Inside the grave were two humans, an older man and a younger woman, buried together, with grave goods suggesting they were people of some significance to their community, and with them, carefully placed, was a dog. Not a wolf, a dog. A dog. Identified as such, both by its physical remains and, more recently, by ancient DNA analysis. The animal had clearly been ill in the final weeks of its life, suffering from a severe infection of the muzzle that would have been agonizing and would have made it impossible to hunt or work. Someone had kept this animal alive through its illness, had fed it, perhaps, or simply stayed with it, and then, when it died, they had buried it with their dead. This is not a working animal placed in a grave for utilitarian reasons. This is a companion. The Bonn Oberkassel dog is, for many researchers, the most emotionally resonant piece of evidence in the entire story of domestication. Not because it tells us when dogs first appeared, but because it tells us what they had already become by 14,000 years ago. They had become beings that people grieved. The most recent and most scientifically comprehensive work on ancient dog DNA was published in Nature in March 2026 in two related studies led by teams that included researchers from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, the Natural History Museum in London, the Francis Crick Institute, the University of Oxford, and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. These studies analyzed genetic material from more than 200 ancient canid remains, dogs and wolves, spanning a period from roughly 40,000 years ago to the present. The findings reshaped the timeline in important ways. The oldest genetically confirmed domesticated dog identified in the study was a 15,800-year-old individual from what is now Turkey. A 14,200-year-old dog from Switzerland, possibly related to the Bon-Oberkassel animal, was also confirmed. These are the oldest animals for which the genetic data unambiguously places them within the domestic dog lineage rather than the wolf lineage. Domesticated dogs were already present and widespread in Western Eurasia, well before the dawn of agriculture, which began in the Middle East roughly 10,000 years ago. The studies also addressed one of the most fiercely debated questions in the field. Did domestication happen once or multiple times in different places? The genetic data pointed with reasonable confidence toward a single origin. All of the ancient dogs examined, regardless of where they were found, Turkey, Germany, Switzerland, Siberia, traced their ancestry back to a single founding event, a single wolf population that was domesticated somewhere at some point and whose descendants then spread across Eurasia. That founding wolf population no longer exists. It is extinct. Modern wolves are not the ancestors of dogs. They are, in a sense, cousins, descended from a common ancestor that diverged when one branch began its long journey toward domestication. The dispersal of early dogs across Eurasia appears to have happened remarkably quickly in evolutionary terms. By the time farming began, dogs were already established from the British Isles to the Korean Peninsula. They moved with human populations, adapted to local conditions, and in some regions interbred with local wolves, adding additional genetic threads to an already complex tapestry. A 2021 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences added another dimension. Genetic comparisons between human and dog populations suggested that dogs were domesticated in Siberia by ancient North Eurasians around 23,000 years ago, and that when the first humans crossed the land bridge from northeastern Asia into the Americas roughly 15,000 years ago, they brought their dogs with them. The first Americans arrived with dogs already at their side. There is something in all of this, in the cold patience of ancient bone, in the chemical signals of a genome 30,000 years old, in the image of a sick dog carried in someone's arms across a frozen landscape that resists being reduced to data alone. The science is real and the data is precise and the conclusions are as well supported as any in modern biology. But underneath it all, there is a story about what it means to keep an animal alive when it can no longer work, and to bury it with your dead, and to carry its descendants across a continent to a new world. That is not biology, or rather, it is biology, and it is also something else, something the data gestures toward, but does not quite contain. Of all the changes that domestication wrought on the wolf, the floppy ears, the shorter face, the altered genome, the quieter adrenal glands, none is more profound, and none is more strange when you really consider it than what happened to the brain. Not the size of the brain, though that changed too. What changed more fundamentally was the orientation of the brain, what it was tuned to pay attention to, what it found meaningful, what it sought out in the world. Somewhere in the long process of becoming a dog, the wolf's mind turned toward the human face, and it has never looked away since. Researchers use the term hypersociability to describe what dogs have. It means, at its simplest, an unusually strong drive to seek social contact, and specifically to seek contact with humans. But it goes much deeper than that. Dogs do not merely enjoy human company. They read human social signals with a precision and sensitivity that no other animal, including our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, comes close to matching. The clearest demonstration of this comes from a series of experiments that are simple in design but striking in their results. In the basic version, a human hides food under one of two identical containers, then points at the one containing the food. Dogs, even very young puppies with minimal human contact, reliably follow the pointing gesture and choose correctly. They understand intuitively that the human's extended arm and finger are communicating something meaningful about the world, that the gesture is a kind of language directed at them, intended to share information. Wolves do not do this. Even wolves raised from puppyhood by humans, socialized extensively with people, given every opportunity to learn human gesture. They do not reliably follow a pointed finger to find hidden food. They will look at the pointing hand, but they do not translate the gesture into information about where to look next. The ability to read human communicative intent is not simply a matter of familiarity with humans. It is something dogs have that wolves do not. It is built in. The contrast becomes even sharper when you change the problem. Give a dog a container it cannot open, one that holds food but is sealed beyond the dog's ability to solve, and watch what happens. The dog will work at the container for a while, then turn and look at the nearest human. It looks to a person's face directly, as if asking for help. It alternates its gaze between the container and the human, back and forth, in a pattern that researchers recognize as referential looking, the same basic communicative act that a human infant uses when it wants an adult's attention directed towards something. Wolves presented with the same unsolvable problem do not do this. They continue working at the container, or they give up and walk away. They do not seek a human face for guidance. They do not recruit humans into their problem solving. The difference is not subtle, it is categorical. What this tells us is that dogs have developed a cognitive specialization, a particular tuning of their social intelligence that is directed specifically at humans. They understand humans as social partners, as entities whose attention and intention can be read and recruited. This is not simply friendliness. It is a form of social cognition that took tens of thousands of years of coevolution to build. The neurochemistry underlying this bond is becoming increasingly well understood. At its center is a molecule called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a small protein, technically a neuropeptide, meaning it acts both as a hormone in the bloodstream and as a signaling molecule within the brain. It is released in many contexts, during birth, during breastfeeding, during physical contact between individuals who trust each other. In humans, it plays a central role in bonding, between parents and infants, between romantic partners, between close friends. When a person makes eye contact with their dog, not staring them down, but the soft mutual gaze that passes between them in a quiet moment, both the person and the dog show a rise in oxytocin levels. In the blood, in the brain, in both species simultaneously. And then, in a feedback loop that researchers find genuinely extraordinary, the rise in the dog's oxytocin causes the dog to gaze at the human more, which causes the human's oxytocin to rise further, which causes the human to respond more warmly to the dog, which causes the dog's oxytocin to rise again. A loop of chemical trust, self-reinforcing, built from eye contact. This is the same basic oxytocin feedback loop that operates between a mother and her infant, the same molecule, the same mechanism. Dogs and humans did not invent a new kind of bonding chemistry. They co-opted an ancient mammalian system that was already there, already doing the work of holding social groups together, and extended it across the boundary between species. There is a 2015 study led by Takafumi Kikusui at Asabu University in Japan that measured oxytocin levels in both dogs and their owners before and after a 30-minute interaction session. The sessions that involved the most mutual gazing, owners looking at their dogs, dogs looking back, produced the largest oxytocin increases in both species. Sessions with wolves and their human carers showed no such effect. The wolves did not engage in prolonged mutual gaze with humans, and their oxytocin levels did not rise in response to human eye contact. This is not a trivial finding. It suggests that the oxytocin feedback loop between dogs and humans is not simply a consequence of dogs being tame. It is a specific, evolved adaptation, something that dogs developed and wolves did not over the course of their long coevolution with us. Research published in 2023 added another layer to this picture. Studies examining the long-term physiological relationship between dogs and their owners found that dogs synchronize their cortisol levels, their stress hormone levels, with the humans they live with. Over weeks and months, a dog's cortisol rhythm begins to track its owners. Stressed owner, stressed dog. Calm owner, calm dog. The animals are not simply responding to immediate cues, they are embedding themselves into the emotional rhythms of the humans they live with in a way that shapes their own biology. And there is the 2023 finding, quietly remarkable, that the coevolution ran in both directions, that human brains were also subtly altered by the long association with dogs. The specific finding is that as dogs took on roles in hunting and guarding, humans may have relaxed certain vigilance systems, the constant, effortful scanning for predators and threats that a life without protective animals would require. The suggestion is that the human brain, over thousands of years of living beside a species that could hear and smell things we could not, may have slightly reduced its investment in certain kinds of alert attention, because that attention was being partially outsourced, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible in a single lifetime, but measurably in the aggregate across the long arc of coevolution. What this means is that dogs and humans did not simply form a relationship. They formed each other. Each species left a mark on the biology of the other, not through any intention, but through the slow, patient pressure of living together, depending on each other, reading each other's faces across the firelight for 30,000 years. The wolf that edged toward the fire changed, and so, quietly, did the people sitting beside it. For most of the history of dogs, a dog was simply a dog. There were regional variations. Animals in cold northern climates tended to be heavier coated and more compact. Animals in hot desert regions tended to be leaner and longer legged. Animals that spent their lives running down prey on open ground looked different from those that helped flush birds from undergrowth. But these differences were gradual, functional, and loosely defined. A traveler moving across Eurasia 10,000 years ago would have encountered dogs that varied in size and coat and build, but nothing like the radical discontinuity that separates a modern Great Dane from a modern Chihuahua or a Greyhound from a Pekingese. The story of how that radical diversity came to exist unfolds in two very different phases, separated by a gap of thousands of years and distinguished by the degree of human intention involved. The first phase spans the long period from early domestication up to roughly 2 or 3 centuries ago. This was a time of what we might call functional selection, not systematic or scientifically organized, but real and directional. Humans in different parts of the world, facing different environments and different needs, kept and bred the dogs that were most useful to them. A nomadic pastoralist on the Eurasian steppe needed a dog that could work through the night in freezing temperatures, that was large enough to deter wolves from a flock, that was independent enough to make decisions without constant human guidance. A coursing hunter in the arid Middle East needed a dog that was built for speed, long-legged, deep-chested, light-boned, capable of maintaining a gallop across open ground long enough to run down a gazelle. A fisherman in the Arctic needed a dog that could haul a loaded sled through deep snow for hours without exhausting itself, that could survive on minimal food, that could sleep outdoors in temperatures that would kill a human in minutes. Each of these needs, applied consistently over many generations of selective breeding, even informal, semi-conscious selective breeding, would shape a population of dogs toward a particular form. not by design in the modern sense, but by the simple practice of keeping the animals that worked best and letting them reproduce. The dogs that pulled the sled most efficiently had puppies that pulled sleds. The dogs that ran fastest had puppies that ran fast. Over centuries, these populations became distinct enough to be recognizable as types, the ancestors of what we now call the Spitz breeds of the far north, the sighthounds of the Middle East and Mediterranean, the Mastiff type guardian dogs of Central Asia. The genetic evidence for this ancient diversification is visible in modern dog genomes. Studies comparing the DNA of dogs from different geographic regions find that some of the deepest genetic divisions between dog populations reflect these ancient functional groupings, that the genes of a modern Siberian Husky carry traces of a lineage that was already distinct from the lineage of a modern Saluki thousands of years ago, long before anyone thought of dog breeds as a formal category. But the diversity of those ancient types, while real, was modest compared to what was coming. The second phase of breed formation is something else entirely, faster, more extreme, more deliberate, and in some ways more consequential for the animals involved. In Victorian Britain, beginning roughly in the middle of the 19th century, dog breeding became a formal cultural institution. Dog shows, competitive exhibitions where dogs were judged against written standards describing the ideal physical form for each type, began to be organized, first informally and then under the governance of newly formed kennel clubs. The Kennel Club in Britain was founded in 1873. The American Kennel Club followed in 1884. These organizations created formal breed registries, published breed standards, and established the rules by which purebred dogs were defined and judged. The consequences were profound, and they played out at a speed that has few parallels in the history of domesticated animals. Within the space of roughly a century and a half, a period representing perhaps 50 to 80 dog generations, the number of formally recognized breeds exploded from a few dozen loose types to more than 400 distinct breeds, each defined by a written standard specifying everything from the precise angle of the shoulder to the acceptable color of the iris. The genetic mechanism that makes such rapid breed formation possible is worth understanding, because it is genuinely surprising. When a small number of founders, say a handful of dogs judged to best exemplify the ideal of a new or newly formalized breed, are used as the basis for a breeding program, something important happens to the genetic variation in that population. It shrinks dramatically. Every individual dog carries 2 copies of each chromosome, and therefore 2 versions of each gene, one inherited from each parent. Within a large, freely interbreeding population, there is enormous variation, thousands of different versions of each gene distributed across millions of individuals. But when you take a small group of founders and breed only within that group, you capture only a tiny fraction of the variation that existed in the larger population. And because the founding group is small, the particular combination of genetic variants they happen to carry, including not just the variants that were selected for, but all the other variants that happen to be present in those particular animals, becomes the genetic foundation of the entire breed. This is called a population bottleneck, and it has a cascading consequence known as genetic hitchhiking, where a gene variant that was not selected for gets dragged along to high frequency, simply because it happened to be sitting on the same chromosome in the same individual as a variant that was selected for. If the founding male of a new breed happened to carry a particular gene variant that causes a specific metabolic disorder, that variant might end up in a large proportion of the breed's descendants, not because anyone wanted it there, but because it rode along, invisibly, beside the genes that made the dog's coat the right color or its head the right shape. This is why so many modern dog breeds carry elevated rates of specific inherited diseases. Dalmatians have a high rate of a condition called hyperuricasuria, an inability to properly process a breakdown product of DNA metabolism, leading to painful bladder stones, because the gene variant responsible happened to be present in the founding population and was inadvertently fixed at high frequency by the bottleneck. Bernese Mountain Dogs have a shortened lifespan, partly attributable to genetic diseases that became concentrated in their founding population. These are not the consequences of anyone wishing harm on these animals. They are the quiet, mechanical consequences of small founding populations and strong selection, playing out in the genome with perfect indifference to the well-being of the animals they shape. The speed of Victorian breed formation, 50 generations to produce hundreds of distinct breeds from a relatively uniform ancestral stock, is a demonstration of how quickly artificial selection can reshape a body plan when the selection pressure is intense and consistent. In 50 generations of wolves, you could not see the beginning of domestication. In 50 generations of Victorian dogs, you got the bulldog, the borzoi, the dachshund, the bloodhound, and the Pomeranian. The raw material was the same basic dog genome, the same developmental biology, the same neural crest cells, and the same regulatory switches. What changed was the intensity and specificity of the selection, and the closed, club-governed breeding populations that allowed genetic changes to accumulate without dilution from outside. The result is the world of dogs we live in today. More than 400 breeds, each a unique biological experiment, each carrying in its body the record of what humans at a particular time and place decided they needed or wanted from an animal. Some of those experiments produced animals of extraordinary capability and beauty. Some produced animals that carry a heavy burden of inherited disease, and all of them, regardless of how extreme or how moderate, trace their ancestry back to that same ancient wolf, standing at the edge of the firelight, choosing to stay. Every transformation has its costs. Evolution, whether driven by natural selection or by the more impatient hand of artificial selection, is not an optimizing process in any simple sense. It does not move toward a perfect outcome. It moves toward whatever reproduces most successfully in a given environment, at a given moment, given the raw material available. And sometimes, in moving toward one thing, it moves away from something else. Sometimes, what is lost is significant. The story of domestication, told honestly, includes the losses alongside the gains. The most consistently documented change across domesticated animals, dogs, pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, is a reduction in brain size relative to body size. This is not a subtle effect. Domestic dogs have measurably smaller brains than wolves of equivalent body size. The reduction is on the order of 10 to 30%, depending on how it is measured and which regions of the brain are compared. This is a real and substantial difference. To understand what this means, it helps to understand why brains are large in the first place. Brains are metabolically expensive. The human brain, for example, represents roughly 2% of body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy at rest. For an animal living in a wild environment where food is scarce and unpredictable, maintaining a large brain is a significant investment. That investment pays off through better problem solving, more accurate threat detection, more flexible social behavior, and more effective navigation across complex territory. In an environment where those capabilities directly determine whether you survive and reproduce, the investment is worth making. But in a domesticated environment, some of those capabilities become less necessary. A dog living alongside humans does not need to range widely across complex territory to find food. Food arrives predictably from a human hand. It does not need to maintain the same level of constant vigilance against predators. Humans provide a degree of protection. It does not need to solve the full suite of problems that a wild wolf must solve every day. Where to find prey, how to read the landscape, how to navigate territorial boundaries with rival packs. Many of those problems are simply absent from the dog's life. In this context, the metabolic cost of maintaining a very large brain begins to outweigh its benefit. Selection, over thousands of generations, would favor individuals that invested slightly less in brain tissue and slightly more in reproduction, in immune function, in the other biological priorities of a well-provisioned life. The brain shrinkage in domesticated animals is not a sign that those animals are less intelligent in every sense. Dogs are remarkably capable in the specific domains that matter to their lives, particularly in reading human social signals. But it reflects a reallocation of biological resources away from the kinds of cognitive capability that are only necessary in a wild, self-sufficient life. The 2023 research that found evidence of brain changes in humans associated with dog domestication suggests this same logic applied to us. As dogs took on roles in hunting, tracking prey, flushing game, pursuing wounded animals, and in guarding camps and settlements at night, humans may have gradually reduced their investment in certain vigilance systems. The specific brain regions implicated involve threat detection and spatial awareness functions that would have been under intense selection in a world without guard animals. With dogs present, those functions could be partially outsourced. The suggestion is not that humans became less intelligent, but that the distribution of cognitive investment shifted, that some of the neural resources previously devoted to constant environmental scanning were freed for other purposes, as the dog's acute senses filled that role. This is, in a sense, the deepest expression of what the human-dog relationship became, not merely companionship, not merely utility, but a genuine division of biological labor, so deep and so sustained that it left marks in the brains of both species. The costs of more recent, more intensive artificial selection are more visible and more immediate. The flat-faced breeds, bulldogs, French bulldogs, pugs, Persian cats share this characteristic, though we are focused on dogs, are perhaps the clearest example. The short snout and compressed skull that characterize these breeds are extreme versions of the neoteny, the retention of juvenile features that domestication naturally produces. They were exaggerated by deliberate selection over the past century and a half because they were found aesthetically appealing. The round face and large eyes trigger the same nurturing response in humans that an infant's face does, and breeders found that dogs with more extreme versions of these features were more popular. But the anatomy of the skull is not merely decorative. It houses the airway, and the airway of a flat-faced dog is severely compromised. The soft tissue of the nose and throat, the soft palate, the nasal passages, the trachea, did not shrink proportionally when the skull was compressed. These dogs breathe through a system that is too large for the space available to it. The result is a condition called brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome, brachycephalic simply meaning short-skulled, in which the dog is chronically unable to breathe efficiently. Many of these animals snore loudly even while awake. They overheat easily because they cannot pant effectively, and panting is the primary mechanism by which dogs regulate body temperature. In warm weather or during exercise, they can be in genuine distress. Many require surgical intervention simply to breathe comfortably. This is not a marginal welfare concern. French bulldogs have become, in the last decade, the most popular breed in several countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States. Millions of animals are living with a structural breathing impairment that was created entirely by human aesthetic preference and enforced by competitive breeding standards. Giant breeds carry their own burdens. The skeletal system of a dog was not designed, in any engineering sense, to carry the weight of a Great Dane or an Irish Wolfhound. The joints of these animals are under stresses that the ancestral wolf's joints never experienced, and the rates of hip dysplasia, elbow dysplasia, and other degenerative joint diseases in giant breeds reflect this. There is also the problem of what geneticists call popular sire effect. When a single male dog, one that wins championships, one that produces aesthetically prized offspring, is used to father very large numbers of puppies, his particular combination of genetic variants, including any disease-causing variants, he happens to carry spreads rapidly through the breed population. Before the era of artificial insemination, a popular show dog might father a few dozen litters in his lifetime. In the era of frozen semen and international shipping, a single male can father tens of thousands of offspring across dozens of countries. The genetic diversity of the breed narrows around that individual, and whatever he carries, the good and the harmful, becomes the inheritance of a generation. These are the costs. They are real, and they deserve to be held clearly, not with anger, and not with the implication that the entire project of domestication was a mistake, one of the most any made, but with the honesty that comes from understanding a process deeply enough to see both what it created and what it consumed. The dog that lies at the foot of your bed tonight, whatever shape it takes, whatever the particular history of its breed, carries in its body both the beauty and the cost of 30,000 years of transformation. It is simultaneously one of the most extraordinary biological achievements in the history of mammals, and a creature whose form was shaped by forces it had no say in. Both things are true. Both things are worth knowing. Come back for a moment to that grave on the Rhine. 14,200 years ago, in a place that would one day be called Bonn Oberkassel, two people were buried together. An older man, perhaps in his 40s or 50s, old by the standards of a Paleolithic life, a younger woman, and between them, or perhaps beside them, a dog. The grave was prepared carefully. The bodies were dusted with red ochre, a pigment used in burial across the ancient world and associated in many cultures with the color of life and blood. The dog's bones were placed with deliberateness. This was not a disposal of remains. This was an act of arrangement, of meaning-making, of the kind of care that implies grief. The dog had been sick. Its bones show the marks of a severe muzzle infection, a distemper-related illness, researchers believe, that would have been visible, painful, and prolonged. It had not been a working animal in its final weeks. It could not have hunted. It could not have guarded. Someone fed it anyway. Someone stayed with it while it was suffering, and when it died, they carried it into the grave with the people it had lived beside. We do not know the names of the man or the woman. We do not know what language they spoke, what they believed about the world, what they dreamed. But we know they kept a sick dog alive and buried it with care, and that tells us something about the texture of their inner lives that no other piece of evidence from that period quite matches. It tells us they formed attachments that persisted through uselessness, that they loved, or something close enough to love that the distinction barely matters. This is what the dog's domestication ultimately means when you follow it all the way down. It is not merely a story about genetics or archaeology or the neural crest hypothesis or the amylase gene. Those things are real and important and worth understanding. But underneath them, supporting them the way bedrock supports a landscape, is something simpler and harder to name. Two kinds of social animal found each other in the cold, and they did not let go. Consider the sheer improbability of it. 4 billion years of organisms eating and being eaten, competing, cooperating, evolving, going extinct. Only one large carnivore has ever crossed the threshold into full. Not the cheetah, though cheetahs were kept by humans in ancient Egypt and India for hunting, and some individuals became remarkably tame. Not the lion, not the hyena, not the bear, not any of the other large predators that have lived alongside human populations across the centuries. Only the wolf, only once. The cheetah comparison is instructive. Cheetahs can be tamed as individuals. They can learn to tolerate human presence, to accept handling, to live in a domestic setting. But they do not breed readily in captivity, and the tame individuals do not pass their tameness reliably to offspring. The process never took hold. The threshold was never crossed. Whatever specific combination of social flexibility, stress response variability, dietary opportunism, and cognitive architecture was required to make domestication possible. The cheetah had most of it, but not quite all. The wolf had all of it, and the wolf also had the particular ecological circumstance of sharing territory with a species that was, in crucial ways, its mirror. The same social structure, the same prey, the same cooperative hunting strategies, the same investment in group relationships that extended over years. When a wolf edged toward a human fire, it was not entering an alien world. It was entering a world that, in its social logic, resembled its own. The domestication of the dog happened before agriculture, before cities, before writing, before almost everything we tend to think of as civilization. It happened in the coldest, hardest, most resource-scarce period our species has endured since we became modern humans, the last glacial maximum, when ice covered a third of the land surface of the earth and survival was a daily negotiation with scarcity. The bond did not form in comfort. It formed in difficulty, in cold, in the shared urgency of finding enough to eat in a frozen world. There is something in that worth sitting with. The oldest friendship was not a luxury. It was forged in necessity, and it endured long after the necessity was gone, long after the glaciers retreated and the megafauna went extinct, and humans built farms and cities and eventually houses with central heating and refrigerators full of food. They stayed when there was no longer any obvious reason for them to stay, except for the bond itself. Across the full span of human history, through the Neolithic, through the Bronze Age, through the rise and fall of every civilization we know about, dogs have been present. In ancient Egypt, dogs were depicted in tomb paintings and given names recorded in hieroglyphs. In ancient Rome, a mosaic at the entrance to a house in Pompeii carries the warning cave canem, beware of the dog, the same warning that hangs on gates today. In medieval Europe, dogs were status symbols, companions, hunters, herders, guards. In the indigenous cultures of the Americas, dogs were partners in the hunt and in ceremony, descendants of the animals that had crossed the Bering Land Bridge alongside the first Americans 15,000 years before. In the trenches of the First World War, dogs served as messengers and as comfort. In hospitals and care homes today, they walk soft-footed beside people who are frightened or in pain, and something in their presence, something in that ancient oxytocin loop, that 30,000-year-old chemistry of mutual attention, helps. The 2023 research suggesting that human brains were subtly reshaped by the long coevolution with dogs adds a strange and beautiful dimension to all of this. If it is true, and the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, as is appropriate for a finding this new, then the presence of dogs in human life has not merely been a cultural or emotional phenomenon, it has been a biological one. We are, in some small measure, a species that was shaped by the domestication of dogs. The relationship runs through our neurology as well as our history. What the dog gave us across those 30,000 years is difficult to fully catalogue. Hunting efficiency, certainly. Warmth at night, almost certainly. There is an old Aboriginal Australian expression, a 3-dog night, meaning a night so cold it takes 3 dogs sleeping against you to survive it. Early warning of approaching predators and strangers. Help in herding livestock once farming began. Assistance in tracking wounded prey. In more recent centuries, service in ways too various to count, from guiding the blind to detecting cancer by scent, from pulling sleds across Arctic ice to sitting quietly beside a child with anxiety on a difficult day at school. But the catalogue misses something. It misses what the Bonn Oberkassel burial captures without words, the dog that was kept alive through its illness and laid in the earth with ochre and care. That dog was not being useful, it was being loved, and the people who buried it were not being rational. They were being human in the fullest sense, forming attachments that outlasted utility, mourning what was lost, marking the passing of a companion with ritual and pigment and the deliberate placement of small bones in cold earth. That gesture, that careful burial, is 14,000 years old, and it is also completely recognizable, completely familiar. Anyone who has ever lost a dog knows exactly what it means. Tonight, if there is a dog somewhere near you, sleeping at the foot of the bed, breathing slowly in another room, the small warm weight of its presence somewhere in the house, know that the creature you live with is the end product of one of the most extraordinary biological journeys in the history of life on this planet. It crossed 30,000 years to get to you. Its ancestors edged toward firelight in a frozen world and stayed, and their descendants stayed, and their descendants after that, through ice ages and migrations and the rise of agriculture and the fall of empires, until the lineage arrived here, in this moment, in this quiet. The science tells us how it happened. The neural crest cells, the amylase genes, the oxytocin loops, the ancient DNA extracted from cold bone. The science is real, and it is deep, and it is worth knowing. But the science does not quite reach the thing itself, the thing that a Paleolithic person felt when they placed a sick dog in a grave beside their dead. The thing that you might feel, if you are honest with yourself, when a dog rests its head on your knee at the end of a hard day and simply stays there. That feeling is old, older than history, older than language. It is written into the biology of both species, molecule by molecule, across a span of time so vast it makes 30,000 years of human history feel like an afternoon. The ice is long gone. The mammoths are long gone. The wolves that first edged toward the firelight are long gone, their lineage extinct, survived only by the animals they became. But the bond remains. It remained through everything. It is, perhaps, the most durable thing our species has ever made. Not built, not designed, not even quite chosen, but grown, slowly, in the cold and the dark, from the simplest possible beginning. A wolf, a fire, a little less fear than the others. And so we leave it there, in that ancient quiet. The story has been told, and the night is very still, and somewhere behind you the day has already grown distant. If there is something warm nearby, let it stay close. Let the words dissolve now, the way firelight does when the last log has burned down to ember. The science, the fossils, the ancient names, let them settle into the dark. You don't need to hold any of it. It will still be true in the morning. Drift now, if you're ready. Sleep well.